joining the NMU College Libertarians, the NMU College Republicans, and Youth for Ron Paul as we present Mr. Robin Corner. I'd like to also remind you this event is being sponsored by your student activity fee. Robin will be presenting tonight on the topic of blue republicanism, a term he coined this summer in one of his many articles published in the Huffington Post. Robin is originally from the UK, and he holds degrees in both physics and philosophy from Cambridge, and now resides in Seattle. Along with his political commentary, Robin also is the founder of Watching America, an organization of over 400 volunteers that is dedicated to translating and printing in English news stories about the U.S. from around the world. I'd like to take this opportunity to please welcome Mr. Robin Corner.
Are we good? I need nods. Okay. Now, I am told that the English accent to American ears makes me either sound clever or makes me sound like I think I'm clever. Neither is particularly the case, and I'm not here because I'm cleverer than any of you, or indeed that I know more about American politics than any of you. In fact, if you're studying politics or history, chances are you know a lot more about American politics than I ever will. I only got here in 2004. Didn't even know that I was interested in politics, but I guess I got a bit of the liberty bug that you can get in America. And now I find myself writing, almost by accident, for the Huffington Post. I should shout out to the Republicans for being here. It's probably against the party doctrine to listen to people that write for the Huffington Post. But in my defense, I should say that I think when they invited me to write for them, they had only seen Watching America, which a lot of liberals love. And they probably thought they were going to get the same kind of down-the-line progressive stuff from me that they get from most of their many thousands of writers. Well, the fact that I'm now here speaking with you about blue republicanism indicates that that wasn't the case. So, right, let's go here. I, by the way, wrote the article whose title is here, If You Love Peace, Become a Blue Republican Just for a Year, specifically for the audience that I know I have at the Huffington Post. Ron Paul people, libertarians, love to get excited to each other about what they believe. And there's a lot of preaching to the converted that goes on. And fun as that is, it doesn't achieve much. So once I realized I had this rather big platform to present my views on, I decided to use it. So, and basically to use it to change some minds. So this talk is also going to be in that spirit. It's really directed at those of liberal sensibilities, to use the word I used in the original article. But that might be people who identify as liberals or progressives, certainly independents, pretty much anybody who supported or voted for Obama last time around. Out of interest, can I get a show of hands? Who was actively or passively happy that Obama won? Okay, well, all right, roughly half. Okay, so I'm guilty, I was. I guess I got caught up in a bit of the excitement. Although part of the reason I supported Obama is probably part of the same reasons I'm here. I think, talking about blue republicanism, a lot of the problems that I had with Bush are now the problems that I have with Obama, as I will describe. Okay, so the superficial argument in the article, If You Love Peace, Become a Blue Republican Just for a Year, is at the top of this slide. The good reasons for voting for Obama, in my opinion, were to, and this is why I supported him, basically to punish what the Republicans had become as a neo-conservative party, not really a conservative party, under George Bush. So a lot of people who I think were hoping for Obama's change, the areas that they were hoping for the change in, was the fact there were all these wars of choice. There is no doubt that we were and still are going to war against countries that do not directly threaten us, and that's costing hundreds of thousands, actually, of innocent lives. Massive abrogation of civil rights, something that I think that Bush started, and I think Obama is happily carrying on. The Patriot Act is the obvious one, but there are lots. Again, so all of this is obvious because it's now hitting our daily lives. You've got the TSA and these kind of intrusions into privacy. and crony corporatism. Under Bush, there was a lot of talk about Halliburton and the no-bid contracts, but I think Obama has taken this to a completely different level with it's really bad to use these words, but Mussolini called it fascism, right? This kind of corporate sponsorship of the state and vice versa. And we have moved so far in that direction that even if you feel comfortable with how far we've gone, I think you have to feel uncomfortable with the direction that we're going in and that it's not really being called enough. A lot of people who've worked in Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, sit on the boards of the Federal Reserve Banks and so on and so forth. Raises a lot of questions. Now, Ron Paul has said that he has to run as a Republican, despite the fact that many wish he would not, wish he would run as a libertarian or an independent, because this is the way that the system is geared. And he's completely right. And my article was to say, look, he's doing what he has to do to get these ideas into the executive, into the presidency, to get him into the presidency. And I think we as voters, I say we as voters, you as voters, I can't vote for another 2.5 years because I'm still British. I'll be a citizen in 2.5 years. So you have to get this right for me because I still want to stay. All right, so this is why I want to see a Ron Paul presidency. So now, for the Republicans who obviously aren't liberals, I hope what I'm going to do is kind of give you a framework that might be more convincing for your liberal friends. And certainly the framework is, seems to be working very well on independence. And I've kind of been wandering around the last few months trying to work out why this blue Republican name has turned into a meme. Why am I invited to speak with you now? I had the pleasure of doing an interview with Judge Napolitano on Freedom Watch and Fox News. I've done about a dozen radio interviews, all since I wrote this article. And so Shakespeare said that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It wouldn't. It really does. The name matters. I think, and you know what, if I'm wrong about this, I'll be interested in your ideas. Democrats for Ron Paul have been going strong for a while, but it hasn't really taken off. And I think part of that is because in as much as America is moving towards Ron Paul, in as much as his support is certainly increasing now faster than it ever has, in as much as that's happening, people are not wanting to identify specifically as Democrat or as Republican. They're looking for something that isn't a party, that isn't a box, that certainly isn't the same old box that America has had for a century, I mean, however far back you want to count it. So I think one of the reasons that this blue Republican name has kind of taken off is that, well, first of all, that it is a name, because you can't sell something that doesn't have a name. So that's, I mean, it's obvious, but it needed to be named. And this article, the article that I wrote in HuffPo, was the one that did that. Libertarianism, sorry guys, has a branding problem. Since I became broadly libertarian, certainly I would call myself a classical liberal a year or two ago, and I've been teaching libertarian ideas. I know that there's just this wall just goes up, right? Because those libertarians, so they're just these, these weirdos out on the end. And one thing I've learned as I've been doing more political writing is that sometimes it's not even as important to get the idea you're trying to convey right as to know what are the key words that will put the walls up of the people reading your article, where they immediately put everything that they're about to read in the rest of your article in a box and don't take any notice of it. They just say, oh, he's just an X. I know I'm not an X, therefore he's got nothing to teach me. So if this article worked, well, this article did work as a piece of political writing, then I think it's because I had that in mind. I also need to give a shout out to a guy called Israel Anderson in Colorado who has a Ron Paul Flicks video. His site is ronpaulflicks.com, and he compiles Ron Paul videos. He read this article and decided in about an hour or two that this was going to be a political movement, which was an assessment I was not able to make. But he did. He bought the domain. He set up the Facebook group. And by the end of the weekend, I think the article came out on Friday, there was 1,000 people on the Facebook group, and it's just got bigger and bigger. And, so now here I am. So I just want to make the point that the success of blue republicanism as a name, it's as much a marketing success as a new political idea. I'm not the first person to have the not very interesting idea of changing your political registration to the party of the person that you want to win. Not new, right? So I'm going to just divide this talk into kind of two halves, basically. And this is a little arrogant. I'm going to tell you what America's problem is, then I'm going to tell you what the Blue Republican solution is. What I've been doing on the Huffington Post, if you kind of search my name, Robin Kerner, on the Huffington Post, you'll see that I've been establishing kind of a body of work, I guess. And I'm trying to subvert this whole left-right paradigm. I like subverting paradigms. It is true that the reality that we can experience is more determined by the concepts through which we experience it, what we already think we know, than by the reality itself. And there's lots of wonderful experiments that have been done in laboratories to prove this time and time again, and if you're interested, we can talk about that. So I want to just give you guys some new concepts. I'm basically going to give a very broad brush stroke of American politics that I think describes American politics more accurately. Obviously, I would think that, because I came up with it, but more accurately than anything you're going to get in the mainstream media or from the mainstream of any party. So, so this is just like kind of a simple slide. I just want to kind of go through where I'm coming from. These are the problems that I feel we have in America. Surface stuff. In these areas, we have gone very far away from what America was intended to be and what I believe America can still be and what I believe America should still be. Everything on this list, I think everything on this list, is somehow driven by fear. The American politics now is a politics of fear, I think. And this is not something that comes just from the left or the right. It is true, and we'll discuss it later, that the left have traditionally harped on with concern about the aggregation of economic power in the hands of a few. And it is equally true that the right have harped on with equal concern, or with equal concern about the aggregation of political power in the hands of the few, namely government. And both are onto something there. But in their actions, the mainstream of the left and right in this country, I'll certainly go back to FDR, probably to Wilson, have done nothing actually to stop the other half of the spectrum going in the direction that they want to go in. If you actually look at how we've got here, this has all been done by left and right together. So, and this is just a few off the top of my head, and there might be more, and some might be more important than others, but here we are. Banking, one word that actually encompasses so much. I'm going to actually talk quite a lot about the monetary system in general, because there's a lot more to it than just banks, obviously, and more to it than meets the eye. But we have a system that systematically, i.e. necessarily and inevitably, moves wealth from those who actually create real wealth to those who do not. And whilst the nature of American money itself does that, we then compound it by rather ad hoc actions by our political masters to make sure that when even that doesn't work, that the financial elites get a help from the political elites. All of this is, of course, unconstitutional. So spending is unconstrained. I'm going to talk about the fact that we have a form of economic totalitarianism, which is not exclusive to the US. It is related to fiat money, and I know that all the Ron Paulites in the room probably know all about fiat money because it's one of Ron Paul's hobby horses. I, by the way, am not going to explain Ron Paul's position on each of these things. I'm not actually going to say much about him in this talk. If you want to find out why everything I say leads me to Ron Paul, and it's not obvious to you, that's cool. Just go and Google him or stick his name into YouTube at the end. I'll make some connections specifically. But obviously everything on this list are things that Ron Paul has been speaking about in ways that I think are correct and that are, with the exception perhaps of Gary Johnson, almost exclusive to him as a presidential candidate. So yeah, cronyism, which I mentioned before. So you've got the JP Morgan, and you've got Goldman Sachs and PIMCO and all these organizations who are actually being given created money to run Fed programs like the mortgage-backed securities scheme and all this kind of thing. And then you've just got this problem of that rotating door, people going from Goldman Sachs into the Treasury or the Federal Reserve and back and whatever. So there's a big problem there. Privacy, this is a big one for me, Fourth Amendment. Patriot Act, you don't have any privacy. There are people listening to completely innocent conversations. They do not have warrants. They are now allowed to do this. This is not how America was intended. To me, this is just obvious on its face that this is a matter of concern. Patriot Act is particularly awful because a federal agent can write a warrant to arrest you or search your premises without any judicial oversight. So this is kind of akin to what you get in some of the African tin pot regimes. I'm not saying we're like an African tin pot regime, but I want to raise the concern that once you start conceding the principles, what then do you use to draw the line? I don't see that we can draw a line any further in the direction of tyranny than we already are. I think the only place it can be drawn is further back to where we came from, back towards the Constitution, which I'll discuss in the part of the lecture that's going to be the solution. Financial privacy. This one really pisses me off because I'm British and I have a British bank account, and even though I declare all my income, something which if you guys don't do, you will have the pleasure of doing for the rest of your life, I have to tell the US government where my bank accounts are and how much money I have in them, even after I've told them about what my income is. So I have no financial privacy. I've stuck assassination up here. The al-Awlaki thing is interesting. You may be amused to know, I was just saying this to the libertarians at dinner, every article that I have written, most of which criticize Obama, for the Huffington Post have been happy to publish. The only one they have refused to publish of mine, which you can find, it was published elsewhere, but the only one that this left-wing huge news organization wouldn't publish was one entitled, "The War on Terror Kills More Americans Than Al-Awlaki Can." That is not my opinion. That is the findings of a multi-million-dollar Department of Defense study, which I just quoted in the article. Some of the progressives who have kind of latched onto the Blue Republican thing think that that was too much for the Huffington Post to take from the left. It's interesting to me, but it proves the point, whatever is the truth of that, I think it proves the point that the assassination of al-Awlaki by executive decree, for want of a better word, obviously extrajudicial, raises questions. It may be the case that there is an argument for that killing. That may be the case. But the questions that it raises about our liberty and the Constitution's demand, I think at the very least, a presidential speech on primetime television to explain to us how we can still as Americans have these rights if he can do that. The question needs to be addressed. So I'm more concerned that the executive would think that they could get away with this and not address it to the American people than the fact that it happened. So that's why I put it on this list. War not in self-defense, we have, that can be a whole lecture in itself. I'm happy to defend that in questions later. Indeed, I will be using the Department of Defense's own information to defend the fact that some of our wars now are wars of choice and not actually out of the national interest. And we now have had Obama going to war. What is it, kinetic military action, is it? We don't go to war anymore. We go to kinetic military action without the representatives of the people agreeing with that or voting for that. Okay, so I've mentioned the next one. Truth is a crime. Under the Patriot Act, you can commit a crime by telling the truth. If a warrant, one of these agent self-served warrants is served on you, you can be forbidden from telling your work colleague, or I think even your husband and your wife, that you've been served with one. So it is actually possible now in this country, I mean this terrifies me, to act criminally by telling the truth. This is the country with the First Amendment. So all of the above, yeah. Constitution. As Jim Clyburn famously said to Judge Napolitano a little while ago, most of what we do here, meaning on the Hill, is unconstitutional. So they're brazen about it now. So that's how far we've got. That's how far we've come. That's why I think all the lights are flashing red danger, and that's why I'm personally obviously supporting Ron Paul. But how did we get here? What is it about us that allows these leaders, if we want to call them that, to have done this to us, both left and right? Everything that has, the Democrat and Republican Party together have brought us to where we are today. So what I want to do in this lecture, in true blue Republican spirit, is I'm going to quote a hero of the left, and I'm going to quote at the end a hero of the right, both of whom I agree with. So here's the hero of the left. I think it's fair to call him that. Noam Chomsky. I'm just going to read this straight out. The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on. while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits on the range of the debate. My talk really is about the presuppositions of the system, because it's what the left and right agree about while maintaining the illusion of disagreement that does more to dictate the state of American politics and economics than, in fact, what they disagree about, in my opinion. Okay, so one of the things that I guess I bring to this discussion, if I can say that, is the fact that I'm not American. So I come to America and I live in this, and things that maybe you guys take for granted, that Americans take for granted, seem a bit weird to me. The most obvious one is the two-party system. A two-party system is only one party away from, you know, like a single-party state, right? And now this system in this country is reinforced, explicitly reinforced by legislation. And even if you go back to Britain, which is an Anglo culture in some ways similar to the US, though obviously a parliamentary system, so different, we still have quite robust governance. We don't have proportional representation. But even in that system, we have a strong third party. This is important because it means that you can't be, let's say, a conservative, Republican conservative, and just demonize the Labour guy, Democrat, and then get the vote of the person who gets your demonization by default, because you're the only party. You know, if it's not that one, then it's got to be this one. In England, for example, if you don't like the Conservatives, you're not necessarily going to be a Labour supporter. You might be a Liberal Democrat. So this kind of personal, this demonization, this whitewashing, this not really addressing issues, but just this thing that kind of goes on in the media a lot, where they persuade you that you don't want to be a member of that group, Democrats or Republicans, for whatever reason. You're not one of them. It's harder to do that in most other developed democracies. And as I say, this is, it's a very American situation. It comes out kind of in the culture, I think. One thing that astonishes, I think, many Europeans is that if you spend a lot of time in America, you discover that you can ask somebody what they think about, I'll just choose two, abortions and taxation. And then you can, with massive accuracy, predict their views about you know, pretty much anything else. You know, the wars or civil rights or gun ownership or whatever it might be. This is uniquely American, and it's largely because people, until now, and it's changing, and one of the reasons I'm here, I guess, is because I'm part of the change. Blue republicanism is, I guess, promoting this change. I forgot what I was going to say at the end of that sentence, but you see where I'm going with it. Let me speak to the left and right specifically. I studied epistemology. After I studied physics at university, I studied epistemology. It's kind of the philosophy of knowledge. How do we know things? And this is why I'm kind of interested in paradigms. The idea of what we already know determines the reality that we experience, that inevitably reinforces what we already know. And it occurs to me that the words left and right do a lot of work on us subconsciously. Left and right, you can divide, I mean, they're words about space, right? They're really physical words. Left's over there for you. Right's over there. Everything is left or right. The illusion of left and right in politics is, if you therefore have heard from someone on the left and someone on the right, you've heard all there is to hear about an issue because you've covered all space. Clearly isn't the case. Americans have gone along with that for many years, but now I think because Americans are discovering the consequence of it, it's starting to hurt economically. It's hurting in terms of civil rights. People are getting fed up with the wars. That there might be another way of doing things that left and right, as traditionally defined, haven't been presenting to us. So the idea of dividing the political spectrum into left and right fails in that way. Right? Left and right sounds a lot more complete than our political discourse is. The other thing about left and right is they're opposite. If it were the case, well, if we assume that when we hear from, let's say, the Republican and the Democrat on CNN, that we're hearing opposing views, if we believe that because we believe one's on the left and one's on the opposite on the right, then what we don't see are all of the points where they agree. The substrate of shared assumptions, of mainstream assumptions that in many cases, people who commentate on policy and actually make policy don't even know that they share in some cases. But what I'm saying is, what the Blue Republican movement, if I can use that word, it's not my word now, but it's somebody else's, so I think if somebody else calls it a movement, I can call it a movement. What the Blue Republican movement is saying is, what we've agreed on, what left and right have agreed on, is more damaging to America and has more impact on our reality now than what they appear to disagree on. And something I'm going to get to later in the solution part of this talk is that left and right, they're symmetrical. And for the and what I mean by that, for the mathematicians or the physicists or the chemists, if two things are symmetrical, you can kind of map one onto the other. One describes the same kind of thing as another, and you can describe one in terms of the other. Left and right, they're both the same kinds of thing. They're directions or they're positions in space. And we kind of assume that when people on the left are doing politics, they're broadly doing, like they think they're doing, they feel like they're doing the same thing as people on the right are doing when they're talking about politics. I actually think that isn't true. I think psychologically being someone of the left and being someone of the right is very different. And I think understanding that is actually a key to getting America out of its current rut. Now, this is the funkiest slide I'm going to put up. It's the most complicated, so maybe we'll take some time on this. I guess the fundamental thesis is left and right agree on and both benefit from crony corporatism. If you catch me saying crony capitalism at any point, please interrupt me. There is nothing vaguely capitalist about what is going wrong with the US. It is corporatist. And whilst crony capitalism is better than capitalism to describe it, it's still wrong. What we have is a system of institutionalized crony corporatism. Now, I think what I'm about to say here is all factual. If not, call me on it later. We have a fiat fractional reserve system. All of the money that we use, not just to transact, but to store our wealth, does not have value in and of itself. It actually has value because it's required to pay taxes in. But because it can be printed without limit, the government and indirectly the financial sector get to determine the value of what we hold economically. I'm going to talk a bit more about this later when I talk a bit about economic totalitarianism. But the way there's a kind of a vicious circle where big government advantages big corporations and vice versa. And I put big corporations here, but the core of the problem is in the banks. If I'm talking about big corporations, the core, it starts with the banks. The Occupy Wall Streeters are now getting sufficiently upset about the concentration of wealth in the hands of big corporations, the banks, that they are on the streets. This is good. America should be angry about it. The Tea Party was already angry about the concentration of power in the hands of the government. This is good. They should be angry about it. But each side has, I would say, half the picture. They each depend on each other. If I'm a big corporation, I want you, a politician, to have more power, to have more stuff that you can give me. I want to know that when I sit down to write the legislation with you, as the pharmaceuticals industry did with Bush, as the health insurance industry did with Obama, and you can just keep choosing the examples, that you have something special to give me. I don't really want your power as a politician, therefore, to be limited as the Constitution would have it limited. And of course, if I'm in government, I am quite happy to favor you if I know that you are going to finance my campaigns. So the two definitely feed off each other. Now, this fiat monetary system, the ability to create money at will without having any real value, I mean, I don't know, some of you will know Ron Paul more than others. He always talks about the gold standard. This is what he's getting at. The gold standard limited the ability of government to expand the monetary supply and therefore buy stuff and do stuff. It therefore limited what they could do politically. This system that really started when the gold window was closed, 1971, Nixon and all of that, funds all of the big projects that government has. It finances the exercise of political power. If, for example, the government could only spend out of revenue, it wouldn't be able to just go and spend $1 trillion on a war that a country doesn't really want, because whilst the war is going on, the financial impact would be immediately clear to the population. They would feel the cost of that political decision. There would be negative feedback against those who decided to make that decision. But it's not just warfare. The same actually can be said of welfare. A lot of the big welfare programs cost massive amounts of money, and as we're going to see in the next slide or two, this very system that enables them to be paid for without the people paying for it, the rest of the taxpayers, feeling the pain immediately, is the same system that creates the poverty that causes the welfare to be required, as some politicians will tell you who are supporting welfare programs when they want your vote. Welfare programs are very popular because politicians want to get up and say, I'm doing something to help. The argument that I want to make, and one of the biggest arguments for Ron Paul is, there's no point trying to fix, let's say trying to treat the symptoms, if the body is riddled with the disease and you do nothing to cure it. This system is the disease. The monetary system is the disease that massively concentrates wealth, moves it from productive workers to the elites, and I'm going to talk about the mechanism in a moment. Now, welfare is a very interesting thing. Remember, I'm writing on the Huffington Post. Progressives, they like their welfare. Whatever the good intention of welfare programs, one thing that it does do is it kind of maintains a certain amount of stability at the bottom of this system. If you look at, let's say, well, let's do some figures from the United States. The bottom 40%, the poorest 40%, so almost half of Americans own 0.3% of American assets. 40% of people own 0.3%. The top 1% own 100 times as much, about 30% of the assets. Right? So that's the kind of skewing that over time, this system, which actually funnels money to banks, and I'm going to describe the mechanism in a moment, has created. Now, you might think, people on the left, who maybe don't know this, much about this, think that, well, the answer is more welfare with more distribution. Now, I maintain, as someone who comes from, as having liberal sensibilities, that you can still be a liberal by intent. You can still want to see social justice and economic justice while admitting that your preferred methods for getting there over 40 or 50 or 60 years or whatever just have failed on the data. They haven't worked, that we can do better. And this, of course, is why I think that Ron Paul, that you can make a good argument, make a good liberal argument for a Ron Paul presidency. I was going to say, in England, where the welfare state is much more rampant than you can probably even imagine here in the US, where we have gone further down that road. Back in 1976, the poorest half of the population owned 12% of the assets, 1976. We have the same system, have a fiat monetary system in England. Now that number is 1%. The bottom half of the British population own 1% of the assets. The welfare enables them to stay there, because what we're doing is still giving them this trickle. We give the poor this trickle. We have decapitalized them, but we have allowed them to subsist at that point. So it is no surprise then that in England, as in the United States, this system over time, since 1971, has increased dependency on government. Welfare has not increased social mobility, economic mobility. The problem then is systemic. One of the reasons I'm arguing for Ron Paul is he gets this. He gets that the problem is the system. Okay. Now, some libertarians know a lot of what I'm about to say, although most don't know all of it. So this is probably going to be the techiest bit, but it's absolutely critical. So I've said before that the system is geared to move wealth to a sector of the population that has a license to do something that if you did it was a crime, and that is to create money. And there's a reason this system is maintained. It benefits those with economic power, and it benefits those with political power. Most money that you use is created as debt. That means a guy goes to a bank and says, I want to borrow $100,000, and the bank says, certainly, and credits the account. That money it's typed into a computer now, it's created out of nothing. That is the expansion of the money supply. That is how 95% of the money that exists, American dollars exist, is created. Now, at the same time that the money, which you could call an asset, is created, the obligation to pay the bank back is created. So there's no net increase in wealth at this point, right? But the obligation to pay the bank back the 100,000 comes with an obligation to pay interest. So let's say over a course of a 10-year loan, there's $50,000 of interest to go on that. So what now is going to happen? The individual that needed the loan from the bank, that the bank was able to create the money to satisfy, is going to transfer over time wealth that he earns in productive labor to the people with the special license to create and move money around, who produce nothing, right? I mean, they directly produce nothing. And if the guy who took out the loan cannot pay it back, then his assets, which are real, which have real value, not just notional value, like a house, say, if he's taking out a mortgage, go to the bank. So the system is set up to transfer productive labor and assets to this segment that creates money. But what makes it even worse is that the interest is not created at the same time that the debt is created, right? So $100,000 is created when the guy walks into the bank to borrow $100,000, but there's another $50,000 obligation. Before that $50,000 gets paid back, someone somewhere has to go into debt to $50,000 to create that $50,000 that it can get paid back to the bank. Are you following me? Give me some nods if this is making sense. All right, excellent. So in other words, this system is built on inflation. And they've got you thinking that inflation is a rather arbitrary increase of prices that goes up and down a bit. No, the inflation is built into the system. The system collapses if Americans decide to stop going into debt. Your serfdom, your debt serfdom, is what this system operates on, with one small sliver of exception. And that is the second part of this slide. The government spends its own money into existence. Now, before I get to that, I should say, I don't want to miss, that this system, the way to protect yourself against this system, again, if you listen to Ron Paul, you know all about this, is that you have to own some assets, to actually own the physical assets, because the money's being created, the value of those assets in those reduced value dollars obviously goes up, meaning that the actual value stays the same. If you just hold money, you get poorer. Now, the people who don't have the money are the 40% at the bottom, right, that I told you about, who only have 3% of the 0.3% of the assets of this country. No liberal can be happy with this system. To maintain a system like this and just maybe, tweak the taxation, tweak the welfare rolls and things like that. So we have a social democracy now. We have a burgeoning social democracy in the US. It's been moving towards what we have in Europe. And it's been failing by the very liberal principles that have been used to justify it. Okay, so now this other piece of this slide is important. Governments spend money to existence. People think that the government raises taxes to pay for things. The government does not need any money in taxation to pay for anything. All the spending the government does is the governmental creation of money. When the government decides it wants to buy a warplane from, Boeing, it credits a private account. There is no offsetting liability. When government spends, the money is created. So now when I said when the bank loans money, the asset's created with a corresponding liability. When the government spends, the asset is created in a private account. It's another way of creating money. But in this case, you could say it creates financial wealth because there's no offsetting liability. Now, why am I getting into the weeds about all of that? Government is not revenue constrained. They kind of want you to think that they are, because it makes us, if you believe that, then you believe they can't do and spend whatever they want whenever they want. They can. In fact, this is a system of kind of governmental economic totalitarianism, because if you were the king of an island, or if you let's say you found yourself on an island with 100 people and you wanted to make yourself king, if you could find a way of forcing them to use a currency that only you could issue, and in saying this, I'm conflating the central bank and the treasury. We can talk about that if you want to. But this is the system you'd set up. You would require the people on that island to pay you in these tokens, Federal Reserve notes. And then you can give them more and take them away. The reason we have taxation is to create demand for the currency that the government controls. The government doesn't need you to give them the money. But by requiring you to give them the money, it means that you have to use the Federal Reserve notes that it exclusively controls. That's why I call this a system of economic totalitarianism. Okay, so that's all a little abstract, all a bit general. let's think about how this actually affects our lives in a practical way over the years. Since 1973, for example, the wages of a skilled American worker have not risen in real terms. Actually, they've gone down slightly. So a skilled American worker is now poorer in terms of income than he was in 1973. That shouldn't surprise anyone. That should actually be obvious, because in the generation of the parents of most of the people in this room, certainly the grandparents, it was actually quite simple to raise a family on a single income. Now it's very difficult to do that. One of the things that we have enjoyed as a Western democracy, and it's the same in Europe, same in the US, over the last generation or so, is an increase of, a commendable increase in in a certain part of, what do I want to say, social rights, social equality. So, for example, now it is easier for a woman to get work in fields that were exclusively open to men before, and to increasingly get a fair income from the work relative to the income that the man will enjoy. So that's good. So there's an opportunity, a social opportunity, opened to half of our population. But what has this economic substrate, this system, done at the same time? How, as we've funded the same mentality that's been promoting these kind of increased social rights? Well, now the mother who might want not to work doesn't have that choice in many cases open to them. So we're getting to a point, I think, where the concessions we've made in terms of economic liberty, and I think liberals have to just face this. This sounds like a conservative talking point, but if you're a principled liberal, you have to face this. They've moved so far that they are now affecting our social liberties, what we can do as social beings. I've said that dependency on government has been increasing. There are figures on that. So, you know, welfare was pitched as being able to increase economic opportunity. Again, the data are in. We've got decades of data now. That hasn't happened. The poor have still been decapitalized as they've been given these meager bits of income. Yeah, and let's talk also about, because this was raised in the debate yesterday, the student loan thing. The student loan thing is good as I mean, it's a good topic in and of itself because it's very important. It's actually, financially, it's quite big. Outstanding student loans are now $1 trillion. We've exceeded credit card debt in this country. So this is a big topic in its own right. But as an example of the problem of government intervention as liberals should be concerned, and not just liberals, but Americans, but even liberals should be concerned about, it's a good example. The American education, the standards have not gone up. I know this firsthand because I've seen, I don't know how many hundreds of resumes for Watching America from people who want to be editors for my website, and a lot of them, I get 3.9, 3.8, 3.7 grade point averages, and I have had one person with a 3.9 grade point average in international relations, so this is an essay subject, who does not know how to use an apostrophe. Does not know how to use an apostrophe. When I got the application, I actually thought, because the name sounded somewhat Arabic, that she might have been a first-generation immigrant. She wasn't. I called her up, and I had this speaking to this, you know, native, not Indian, but native American, and I was a bit wrong-footed. So the cost of education in this country has been increasing hugely without a increasing quality of product or service. Again, we shouldn't be surprised. The corporations that lend you the money, those loans, you probably know this, but I want to make sure everybody knows this before I move on, are guaranteed by the government. It is a risk-free business. If you, and if I am a school and I know that you can find the money as students to pay whatever fees that I set, because the money will definitely be loaned to you, because the government will guarantee that loan, I will pump the fees, and that's what's happened. So this is a perfect example of politicians getting votes, getting credit from the population for what sounds like a good program, and I guess it was well-intentioned, to help put people into school. But the outcome has been what? Well, the outcome is now becoming the opposite. Because I think many students, many young people are starting to make the decision, is this education worth this debt? And if they're not starting to ask that question, they should be. Because from what I see, the resumes I see, probably isn't in a lot of cases. Okay, so why am I in America even caring about this? Even why am I bothering to come to Marquette from Seattle to talk about it? Because it all sounds pretty hopeless. It isn't. It's pretty hopeless, but it's not completely hopeless. There's still hope. And I'm going to keep writing until, well, until my hand drops off, accordingly. And let me just talk a little bit about why I think I'm going to say this. America is exceptional. I don't have this hope for Europe. I don't have this hope for the country that I was born in. I'm sad to say. And I have very specific reasons for that, which, again, we can talk about later. This isn't a talk about Europe. But I'll give you a little anecdote. I was stuck in a traffic jam in Los Angeles many, many years ago, and I had it on public radio. And there was an interview with a gentleman called Greg Palast, who is an American who moved to England. He is a journalist, and I think it's fair to say he's a liberal journalist. And he moved to England because he felt that his work, he's an investigative journalist, a very good one, wasn't getting the play that it deserved. And he wasn't having the impact he wanted to have in the United States. So he went to England, and sure enough, he went to England, and he very quickly became a correspondent for the BBC and The Guardian. I do not generally recommend The Guardian's editorial pages, because they don't understand half of what I'm telling you guys. But they do some good journalism, and good investigative journalism, and I would credit Greg Palast for being part of that. He was asked by the interviewer on this public radio station about the fact that he had one or two children. He had some young kids, newly born. And the host of the radio show asked him, do you want to bring them up in Britain or Europe? Or will you come back to the US to bring up your children? Because obviously, I mean, that's a big decision. And this guy who made his career in Britain as a journalist, who basically was rejected by journalism in the US, said, I'm going to come back to the States with my children. And the host asked him why. He said, because in Britain and in most of Europe, as far as he could tell, everybody knows they're getting screwed. Like the stereotype about Americans being a little more ignorant and having the wool pulled over their eyes and not being well-traveled and all of that. There's some truth in that. There's a lot of things that are being done to Americans in America that they just don't know about, where correspondingly the Europeans know what's happening to them. But in Europe, they just don't care. They just think, well, shit, that's the way it is. And there is a lot of truth in that. Britain is a very apathetic country when put next to the go-get, the success orientation of the United States. Even now, I feel it. It's one of the reasons I'm here. And he said, but in America, he said, well, there's a reason for Americans being like that. There's massive vested interest in keeping Americans ignorant because Americans would get bloody angry if they knew what was being done. Well, I was stuck in this traffic jam about, oh my God, it was probably 2005, 2006, when the political landscape was very different. Well, I think now Americans are getting a bit angry. I think that's what we're starting to see. Tea parties, Occupy Wall Street. I don't obviously agree with everything of all of these people say. It's obviously got a lot further to go, but I think the anger is a step in the right direction. And a lot of the anger in the US, ignorant as Europeans like to think Americans are politically, is actually a lot more philosophical in America, in my opinion. As someone who translates hundreds of articles from around the world about the United States, I think Americans are a little more philosophical about their politics, because when Americans talk about politics, they at least are talking about ideas of freedom. They know what the idea of monopoly of power means. They know that that's probably referring to government. I mean, these are kind of philosophical notions. In England, all the politics is about, it's tweaking at the margins. Do we cut a little bit from the health service, or do we add a little bit? They're not really political disputes of principle. I think this potentially, if Americans want to run with this aspect of their nation, I think this bodes well. So that's kind of the cultural, the political context. Now, again, a little more superficially, there was a catalyst, right? We had hope and change. It was all hope and change. A lot of us supported hope and change in 2008. And we didn't even know exactly what the change was going to be, but we know we hoped we would get it. And what's different, right? What's different? It's a very stark compare and contrast. That because we had Bush and we had this big swing, that the starkness of that expected contrast that never happened is, I guess one might say the contrast is conspicuous by its absence. This is kind of catalyzing what's going on right now. And of course, the one that always changes things politically is the fact that we're hurting. Americans are in a very bad way. There was one fact that I should have said earlier. This concentration of wealth, this decapitalization of the working American, it's also reflected in statistics for corporate wealth. There are 43,000 transnationals in the world. 417 of them, 417, less than 1%, control 40% of all of the wealth controlled by all transnationals. It's astonishing. And it's understandable that we would be getting angry about it. Okay, but of course the best thing that America has, that nobody else does, and my God, please use it, is the Constitution. It's an amazing thing. This is your built-in solution. I was here for years until I actually read it and started to work out its implications. One thing that's very interesting to me is that, again, until now, I think it's changing. I want to promote this change. Constitutionalism was a kind of conservatism. We've always talked here about constitutional conservatives. Never heard the term constitutional liberals. Not sure why not. I don't think the Constitution, well, I could say the Constitution is, this is what I'll say. The Constitution is neither conservative with a big C nor liberal with a big L. It's both conservative and liberal with a small c and a small l. It definitely transcends this left-right paradigm. Why? Because it says first to do no harm. It's the Hippocratic Oath for politicians. And I think it's critical to understand that if not all, then nearly all of the biggest problems facing America now are not the result of government in particular standing by, not doing something it needed to do that was legitimately within its remit. It's that the government acted usually out of good intention, and there were unintended consequences, and those consequences have got us into a mess. In each of the cases, each of those things would have not have happened if the Constitution had been applied at the point the policy was made. I've written articles about this. I think American exceptionalism is silly to most people on the left. But I would like America, as a kind of an ambassador from the rest of the world with a funny accent, please know that what you've got is golden. The Europeans on December the 1st, 2009, created their own constitution that is so bad that all of the countries that were asked to vote on it in referenda voted it down. And the tyrannical institution, which is the European Union, have imposed it against the will of the people anyway. And it's like this big, right? Now, I'm happy if someone wants to correct me about, in the assertion I'm about to make, who studied American history. If you know differently, please argue with me later. But it is not my impression that the founders of this country who created the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, which really is profoundly liberal, classical liberal, thought of themselves as progressives. They thought of themselves as conservatives. They were conserving a tradition, a birthright that they had basically that came from Britain, English common law, that the powers above them, King George, whatever, the British monarchy and everything that was going on in Britain, had removed from them. They already had them as people in the Anglo tradition, but there was a tyranny that was not allowing the founders at that time to enjoy the rights that they had. And that's why they wrote the Constitution. They were really conservatives, but they were conserving liberal values, classical liberal values. Now, to me, that is a description of the situation that we're in. Except, really, our job now is a lot easier than it was back in 1770s, right? Because the Constitution has already been written. Nobody has to kind of go under the threat of execution by standing up for this Constitution that they have to write. All they've got to do is say, look, we already have this. This is our law. So I get very excited about the Constitution. Now, I'm coming towards the end. I want to, I guess, but this is important in terms of understanding what I'm trying to do here with this whole Blue Republican movement. And it's important, I think, in opening up the space, opening up people's minds, getting them out of the partisanship so they can be receptive to, the different kind of politics that I think Ron Paul represents. For me, a vote for Ron Paul is a vote for systemic change. It's a vote for someone who understands a lot of what I'm saying, who realizes that having the traditional discussions about welfare, about taxation, about do we or don't we go into that particular country, are all kind of irrelevant if all of this system is still in place. Now, one of the things I said about left and right, which I want to come back to now, is that they're not symmetrical, so I want to explain that. This was an aha moment for me, and I don't know if it's going to sound as convincing to you as it did to me when I thought of it. Again, tell me if it doesn't in the questions afterwards. Have you ever noticed that your friends on the left think that the people they know on the right are basically not very good people, kind of cold, kind of callous? It's more of a moral judgment. But people on the right, so Republicans, you tend not to go around thinking that the people on the left are morally flawed. You tend to think that sometimes they're stupid and they don't know stuff. Right? They're just wrong. Right? And so I was trying to kind of schematize this, and I think I've got it. The politics of the left are the politics of intentions. If you are on the left, you basically believe, you have this assumption, you may not even have said it to yourself, that policy works, right? That good policy is a policy that enforces some good intention. If the policy well captures a good goal, it's a good policy. That's the point. That's what you do politics for. So if I believe that that's what policy is made out of, and I see that you on the right disagree with me, you want an opposite policy, and I know my policy is out of the goodness of my heart and my love for America and humanity and wanting the poor not to be poor, then obviously, if that's me, you must have opposite views. You must be happy with the poor to be poor and not care as much about people as I do. But that's because left and right, and indeed this happens in all aspects of human life, we always try and understand those different from us through our own paradigms, right? That word paradigm again. I think that if you're on the right, you just don't share the unstated assumption that policy actually works in that way. If you're on the right, you're more likely to think that good policy is policy that has good outcomes, but you can't legislate the outcome. You really only legislate the way things work, but the outcome is a lot more complex to get to from the policy itself. And now there was this phrase, reality, what do they call it? There was a lot of it going on with the Obama campaign. There was the reality-based community. And they were, it was kind of a liberal thing in the blogosphere. They called themselves reality-based. But in some ways, I think, I'm talking about the decent right. I'm not talking to neoconservatives, hardliners, and I'm not talking to socialists. I haven't got anything to say to either of them because they're committed in their illiberalism, as far as I'm concerned. But most people are not out on the edges. So I'm talking about, I think there's a space here. I think people on the left can realize that those on the right are not trying to make policy out of good intention because they just don't think policy works that way. Similarly, people on the right can look at those on the left and say, well, look, it's not that you're in, there's not that there's anything wrong with your intention. I acknowledge your intention. I acknowledge your intention for social justice. I can discuss with you on a basis of preferring economic change, or the change I want to see, and I think Ron Paul is part of it, is saying, look, we need to put these two together. There is a conservative liberalism, or a liberal small L conservatism, where you go, well, you know what? I'm going to let this guy tell you. Here's the hero of the right that I was going to quote.
A society that aims for equality before liberty will end up with neither equality nor liberty. And a society that aims first for liberty will not end up with equality, but it will end up with a closer approach to equality than any other kind of system that has ever been developed. Now, that conclusion is based both on evidence from history, across history, and also, I believe, on reasoning which, if you try to follow through the implications of aiming first at equality, will become clear. You can only aim at equality by giving some people the right to take things from others. And what ultimately happens when you aim at equality is that A and B decide what C shall do for D. Except that they take a little bit of a commission off on the way.
And that, I contend, is what the data of this country over the last few years suggest have happened. Now, and if you stick my A, B, C, and D into what he just said, you see I can do one for the Tea Party and one for the occupiers. I can do one for the left and one for the right. Turns out this guy is right. Now, where's my view? There we go. Okay. Sorry. Oh, really? Do I have to? Oh, God. Yeah, okay. Where do I have that? So I think that's, I mean, Milton Friedman was saying that years ago. And obviously back then, liberals would have agreed with him, and still a lot of liberals think that Milton Friedman is some evil, conservative, whatever, free marketeer. But that prediction, I think, describes exactly what we've got going on now. And I think liberals and conservatives should be equally concerned about it. And I think that, well, again, one thing Ron Paul says is, this liberty idea, you can't pick and choose it. It's either a principle or it isn't. And I think this kind of argument works, as I say, for the left, for the right. So this is what I'm trying to do. So this is kind of my take home. The mainstream of American politics, kind of up here, donkeys and elephants, that's all they are, donkeys and elephants on this diagram. And the people like, Ron Paul, people who like the Constitution, people maybe on the left like Dennis Kucinich, who talk a lot about the Constitution and sometimes wave it on CNN. They're the kooks, apparently. So the mainstream opinion is that foreign wars against countries that don't threaten us is okay. This monetary system that funnels money automatically to these elites is okay. The Bill of Rights is just an inconvenience. Politicians shouldn't take any notice of it. These are all mainstream views. And those that just disagree with those things are the extremists. What I would like to see and what I'm fighting for is just the line, turn from vertical to horizontal. I want people to realize that everything that we've thought of has been mainstream have been, in respect of all the things that I've been talking about, really very un-American and really quite extreme. The Constitution, Blue Republicanism, Ron Paul are people more concerned with political method. And the information that we have over this century in this country and in other Western democracies is that it's the political methods, it's the principles on which you base political decision-making that actually determine outcomes. If you concede principles of liberty, if you concede principles of governing by law rather than by man, which, by the way, is what happens if you don't follow the Constitution, you're already at tyranny, right? You've already conceded tyranny as a political method because you're saying that what I think as a politician now is more important than the constraints I'm legally under. The Constitution is American law, after all. So I would like to hear one day, CNBC and CNN and MSNBC, rather than talking about having, left versus right, talking about having illiberal versus classical liberal, because that's really what we're talking about. And it's around this idea of classical liberalism, which I actually think in so many ways is common sense, certainly to many Americans. The Constitution is really a classical liberal project. Most Americans who might not even care to think this deeply about this stuff are usually by default somewhat classical liberal. They want to be economically somewhat conservative, responsible, and socially they're basically live and let live. If it doesn't hurt me, it's not up to me to tell you what to do. That seems to me to be in the spirit of this country. So I actually think that This is the divide that matters already, even if America isn't conscious of it. Those that are certainly coming to this blue Republican movement, which are now numbering in the tens of thousands. I mean, I know that just because I'm the guy that gets all the emails, runs the Facebook group and so on and so forth. This is the redivide that they're starting to use to filter the flotsam and jetsam of American politics. I do think, I mentioned fear and love, and I know it's a bit weird. I was kind of delighted when I discovered Ron Paul and saw that Ron Paul logo, revolution with EVOL, picked out in red. In fact, the first big Ron Paul article I ever wrote that, got a lot of attention was called Ron Paul and the Love Revolution of 2012. I was kind of struck by that because I thought it was weird. I couldn't really imagine a politician in a debate, like a Republican debates, actually talking about love as it pertains to politics. But the thing about love is, if you love someone, you say to them, as you wish. Right? You want for your loved one what they wish for themselves. Well, that is Ron Paul's politics, right? It's not up to me to tell you. Even when I profoundly disagree with you, I'll give you my best guess, but it's not up to me to tell you what to do. It's not up to me to make you do what I want you to do, what I would do. That's in contrast to most of what mainstream politics is today, which is we have this Republican vision or we have this Democrat vision, and you've got to buy into it. You buy into this vision and then vote for it. Ron Paul doesn't really care what you want to do with your freedom as long as you're free. He's more concerned with the method, with like the political context in which you live, rather than this political destination, this picture of the country that he wants to mold it into, because the Constitution doesn't give him that role. And all of the things that, as I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again now at the end, all of the things that I'm most disturbed about the US, all of these rights that are being given up, in every case, the right is being given up out of fear. Fear is the opposite of expansive. It is contractive. It is the antithesis of love, right? So it's a good question to ask. If ever you hear a political proposition, just ask where it comes from. Don't ask if it comes left or right. Ask if it comes fear or love. It's sometimes compelling. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide because it basically just summarizes everything that I've said, except I would just point out this notion here. Don't be surprised that the man who can make the USA safe for liberals is a conservative. It has precedent. I believe that Ron Paul and those who share his views would make an America safer for those who are principled liberal or principled conservative. I do not think there is anything actually principled conservative or principled liberal about mainstream Republican Party right now, or the mainstream Democrats, certainly. But Churchill was a conservative. But when he stood alone against Hitler in the 1940s, when Britain stood alone against the Germans, he saw himself as a conservative, royalist, imperialist. But the world that he saved is basically a social democratic world. We have a social democratic Europe. The founders themselves, as I said, that document that they created is small L, a liberal document. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, it's really a liberal document. But they were conservatives. This is the area where, this is why we shouldn't be surprised. This is why I think there's value in pitching Ron Paul, who in some ways, of course, can call himself an arch-conservative, to a liberal audience. And the fact that the Blue Republican brand is rising, I think, is testament to that. And obviously, my ultimate dream is, I've got to say Blue Republican, because everything I'm pitching to you is not mainstream Republican playbook, as our friends in the third row can attest. But I do think the Republican Party is moving in the direction of the recognition of that, in as much as it has been moving in the direction of Ron Paul. So if this works, certainly if Ron Paul is elected, then blue republicanism just becomes republicanism, which in many ways is more like what the Republican Party, more like the roots of the Republican Party. There are many ways in which I think it's fair to say, and again, you guys might want to correct me on this, but I think it's fair to say that the Republican Party, as it was steered under Bush, has moved away from some of its more traditional roots. Okay, so I'm done. This is my list of just bullets that I think the occupiers of Wall Street and the Tea Partiers, the real ones, not the, there's some neocons who've hijacked the Tea Partiers, and there's some stark raving Marxist crazies in the Occupy Wall Street movement. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about, those kind of decent people that are out on the streets, Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street, because they just sense something's wrong. Now, I think that we could agree, those two groups could agree on, if not all of this, then certainly nearly all of them. If we could just change these things, then we put America so far back on the track to what America was meant to be that most of the problems that I've discussed today get solved. Now, nobody is thinking that we're close to actually doing this. I don't see a Tea Party representative and an OWS representative sitting in a dark room coming up with, this new agreement soon. But I am starting to see in the blogosphere and all this stuff, and certainly among people who like the Blue Republican idea, they get this. They get this. They get that the point of the debate, that the points to be debated now, where the stakes are high, are not the areas where the parties have been disagreeing. All the culture war stuff that we had under Bush and before. That's not what there is to play for. What there is to play for is those areas where the mainstream has agreed. They agree with this illiberal notion that they know what's best for us. And we now need to turn America back to the founding idea, which is that the only person who knows best for you is you, and your fundamental right is to be left alive. And those that would, for good reason, impinge on that right, that the moral burden is on them. So I'm done. Thanks a lot. Be interested to hear your thoughts.
Does anybody have any questions for Robin this evening? Just raise your hand. I'll come and bring the microphone.
Hi, thank you, Robin. I just had a question. You talked a lot about some of the problems in the United States right now with a two-party system, everything being systemic at its core, and you said Ron Paul is the candidate because he wants to make systematic changes. But even if he were to be elected president for a 4-year term, that would be a lot of radical change that would be occurring. That's scary to a lot of people, and I think a lot of people are afraid of Ron Paul's ideas because we don't see a transition, like an area for transition. And so is that something that can be done smoothly? Is that something that's going to, the revolution with the love in it? I
think the fact that Ron Paul is standing as a Republican shows that he's kind of enough of a political realist. And he's, again, this is something that you kind of, if you're arguing with progressives, you kind of have to keep going back to. He's been clear that he doesn't want to just, wake up the first day he's president in this new libertarian utopia. It's not going to happen. We have, as a society, made people dependent, unfortunately, on all of these, on this, welfareism programs, whatever it is, even on our militarism. We've done that, and we have a responsibility to be careful and caring in how we take down those things that need to be taken down in the long run. So Ron Paul himself, again, Google and YouTube are your friends. He's talked about how this would be done in various areas. But I don't know, if you'd want to be more specific, I guess you'd have to ask about those specific areas.
Sure.
Yeah. You have any other questions? Or?
In a society that's largely polarized, left and right and wrong, rich and poor, how do you make the transition with winners and losers? Say I'm, for example, a Social Security recipient, and the discussion is on changing the Social Security system. If I'm receiving those benefits, I perceive myself as a winner, as a loser if the system changes. How do we get more people and more votes to move in the direction of what might be considered a more altruistic society, which may be what Ron Paul is talking about?
Yeah.
So you've got to take these ideas and move to a system to take the action and get the votes to get to where you want to be. How do you do that?
I think that, well, obviously, I guess part of part of my answer to that would be, you know, write lots of good articles on a website that a lot of people read, and then go to universities and talk about it. But seriously, I mean, you're right, this is the $64,000 question, isn't it? I think you have to inform people about those aspects of their situation, the cause of the situation that they cannot see. And one of the reasons that that we are so entrenched in this kind of welfarist, social democratic, whatever you want to call it, situation is that whilst I'm receiving my welfare check, let's say, I feel I see the value of that check. I do not see that I am part of a 40% that is being decapitalized. I can't immediately see that. If I took stock of if I could get a perspective on my life, and I could say, whereas back before this particular program existed, you had a much greater chance of acquiring assets and moving out of your current situation than you do now, over a lifetime, over 5 years, over 10 years. If I could see that, I might have a different point of view. Nobody's saying that to these people, which I think is why the Ron Paul movement is so important. The other thing is that the system is designed to enable us not to see the consequences of the systems that we put in place. We have a system where, as I say, because those who pay for, let's say, welfare don't feel the pain, which is actually distributed over time through inflation by rising prices, so on and so forth. The people who are funding it don't complain, and the people who are on the receiving end, they have been dehumanized. The transaction has been dehumanized because if I give you something and I live in your community, you get to see the effect of my giving you something has on me. There's some kind of sense of human reciprocity, some kind of sense of empathy, some kind of sense of maybe responsibility. If I could see that you were blowing the check that I gave you on drugs, I may not give it to you next time. So we have taken away, the system that we've instituted is one where the problems we're trying to solve are being solved in a way that is independent of the causes of the problems. We've made a complete mess of it. Recognizing all those things, publicizing all those things is important. Although I would say that, obviously, people who are in, let's say, great poverty and have to worry about how they're going to feed their kid with their small welfare check, they're going to have better things to think about than these kind of topics. I think, but this is the tyranny of democracy, right? The tyranny of democracy is that politicians can pay people to vote a certain way. If I was that, let's say, single welfare mother and I was trying to make ends meet, I'm going to vote for the guy that promises me the biggest check as soon as I left him. That's what I'm going to do. I don't think I'd be targeting that person. I'd be putting all the information out there. I don't think I'd be targeting that person. I'd be getting out the message, the rest of the message that I'm trying to share with you, to the people that aren't that person, to enough. Because this has been enabled by caring people of liberal sensibility who want to live in a world where they don't want to be treading over, walking over homeless people in the street. They don't want to think of kids starving and going to bed hungry. The intentions are already in place. These people are already, and if we can talk to them in the right way, they're already in the right space. They just have to be shown that the methods that they have been using to get to these ends have failed by the very standards that they applied. Then the change will happen itself. I think that's just an informational thing. I mean, that really is just having people with the kind of platform that politicians running, for the presidency have. They need to explain that. They need to, I mean, hell, I'm just nobody'd heard of me before I wrote this article on the Huffington Post. Now I can Google myself, at the end of a week and see a bunch of other people have picked up on it and they're running with it. It's, so, again, it's a question of getting to the critical mass. Maybe it's an unsatisfying answer, but when the systemic change happens, it will happen suddenly. It will happen because we reached a critical mass, and nobody will have known in advance exactly what that critical mass was to be. But it was ever thus. That's always the way it works. And I actually wrote an article to that effect called Ron Paul Can Win, which was the biggest article in terms of readership that I've ever written, that speaks a bit more to that idea. Yeah, I don't know. Is that to your point?
Actually, there's probably not an answer to that question.
Do you want to come back at me? I'm good.
It's a process, and I guess more what I'm looking for is how the processes are initiated and carried forward. You know, if it's co-elected percentage is part of that, and hopefully that's the right device.
There are, I mean, I don't know if this is more what you were getting at, but I know, for example, having kind of come out publicly as a Ron Paul supporter, that there are ways of playing the system that could maybe more practically speak to what you're asking me about. For example, in lots of parts of the country, the more libertarian Republicans, the Ron Paul supporters, have control or are getting control of more precincts than their numbers would currently suggest that they would have. Now, if they can do that, if they can just be clever, if they can work out the political mechanisms that they need to exploit to give themselves the platform to be, to advancing these ideas, and indeed taking over, more seats. It may not be the presidency, but it will be, state seats or even more local levels. Then again, bit by bit, this will happen. I mean, there are ways to play the political system that I know the Ron Paul Nation, as they call themselves, are starting to get increasingly savvy at. Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not doing blue republicanism because Ron Paul exists and he's the be-all and end-all. I mean, as I've written, he's not a panacea. There's no such thing as a political panacea, really. But he's the closest thing that has a shot now. And I would say that if this country were to vote that man into the presidency, so much would have changed for that to have happened that we would be in something of a different world afterwards. So again, at that point, all bets would be off and all things would be possible. I mean, the source of my hope, and what motivates me in some ways, is that everybody's a lot more ignorant than we think we are. There's a lot more things are possible than we imagine, just because, we're not that smart. Human beings just aren't that smart. Nations are more complex things. So Ron Paul will come and go, and if Ron Paul doesn't win the presidency, he'll go. But I think that the changes, these issues that he, in some areas single-handedly, has put into mainstream debate, finally, after 30 years of just banging on about them. I mean, there are things that were kooky topics 4 years ago that are now right up there in the Republican debates. That's largely thanks to Ron Paul. That might be his legacy. And if that is all his legacy is, that's a huge one. The America that he has already changed, that he has made, will have in it different people. Because the Ron Paul Nation, they're quite young, a young demographic. They're highly diverse and they're young. So people with these views more like these are coming up. This is a taste of what the Republican Party could become. I mean, I really believe that. And I will celebrate that, and then, here I'll be giving blue Republican talks, and I won't be saying Ron Paul. I'll be mentioning, the Libertarian or whatever congressman in whatever district I'm giving the talk. So, yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any other questions?
Well, thank you for coming this evening. I'm taking a course that's focusing on the founding era and the founding era and the framers, and we haven't really talked anything conservative. So I kind of want your social memory of the founders being conservative and that influencing the Constitution.
You would say that the...
Oh, I'm not taking a side. I just want to hear your thoughts on it.
Are you... Okay, so you're not suggesting that the founders were not conserving?
No, I just want to hear your theory about it to add to my collection.
I guess I'm... Now, okay, first of all, I should plead my ignorance. So first of all, I should say most of what you guys would have read in an, I don't know, constitutional law or US history class, I am yet to read. I've got so much stuff I'm catching up on. But the founders, the principles that were being discussed were principles that came out of a past that they already believed they had a right to. So whilst you could say the principles were liberal, they were conserving the liberality that was due to them, small l, rather than progressivism. And I guess I would I guess I would say I don't know of anything. My answer to your question would be, I don't know of anything any of them ever said that was contrary to that. But I might be wrong, and you can tell me that whatever it was. But yeah, no, I mean, I think they saw that they were trying. What they were doing was restorative, right? They weren't trying to claim something new that they had never had, that they didn't already have a perception of because of their recent history, as Anglos, let's say, right? Certainly American common law. I mean, let's be clear. The support for the revolution on these shores was not much different in terms of proportionally from the support that it had back in Britain. I mean, there was as many people in Britain, huge numbers, who were very glad, and there's a wonderful quote about this that I don't have. There were people standing up in Parliament saying, thank God that those Brits, basically, over there, are standing up for those rights that we all know are due to, all men, right, as it was back then. So that assertion that I made is kind of, I would say, is supported kind of from both sides of that chasm, as it ended up being.
I guess we have time for one more question right here.
Thanks. I just had a question about, you commented that Ron Paul, if elected, could change the makeup of the Republican Party. He could make it a party that could bring about these systemic changes. But do you think that this current situation would change if we remain a solely two-party system, even if Ron Paul is the head of the Republican Party?
I would like to think that if Ron Paul's leadership started to redefine the Republican Party, that part of that, the change that would have on American politics would be that we would get rid of some of these awful laws that maintain this kind of political duopoly. I mean, I can hope. What can I say? I think getting Ron Paul in would be an improvement. I think having not a two-party system would be an improvement. I think having both would be the biggest improvement. I will take whatever I can get.
All right, let's thank everybody for coming out tonight. I'd also like to remind you that the NMU College Republicans and Libertarians are also sponsoring tomorrow night. Mr. David Keene, the president of the National Rifle Association, he'll be speaking right here in this building in Jermage 102 at 8 p.m. Let's give one more round of applause for Robin for coming out tonight. Thank you, and if you'd like more information about Ron Paul, please stick around. You can, on the back, we have a few flyers and handouts, stickers, and things like that. But thank you all for coming.